I'm so excited. I'm literally peeing my pants, chat. This is so exciting. I told you to stop pissing yourself and get a gamer, but I'm sorry. Today I have a wonderful jazz history wrapped presentation for you guys. Hi, my name's Astrea Colornatura. I'm your favorite coloratura soprano, vocal coach, and a singer. And today we're going to be doing jazz history wrapped. Get ready, get strapped in, because we're going to be doing a crash course in jazz history. So, some of the top artists, and I won't be able to name every single artist, but one big album that you'll find that a lot of people will go back to, and I was like, Kind of Blue by Miles Davis. If you don't know this album, you'll probably hear people raving about it like crazy. A lot of these artists, you may not know their names or whatnot, but you'll probably recognize the music that they do. For example, if you've ever heard Take 5, that is actually by Dave Brubeck. Or if you've heard da 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 da, that song was called The Entertainer. That's actually by Scott Joplin, one of the biggest ragtime musicians. These are kind of in chronological order from like oldest to like the newest being Chick Corea. If you want to pick one of these artists and like kind of look them up and look at their stuff, you'll get an idea of each era because they're all kind of evenly spaced apart. Not super evenly spaced apart, but they're spaced apart enough. So if you were just like, hey, Australia, just give me like a random person to listen to, I would say any of these guys or gals on this list would be a great kind of change of what you're probably used to listening to jazz. So there are actually estimated to be over 70 million listeners of jazz worldwide. But that is a huge population of the earth that actually is dedicated to listening to jazz. I thought that that would be a nice little statistic to throw out there because it kind of shows how many people out there actually really enjoy the genre of jazz.
You like jazz?
But some of my top artists include Hiromi Uehara, Thundercat, Shiina Ringo, Jacob Collier, and 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒. Hiromi is an amazing jazz pianist, Japanese jazz pianist. Thundercat is a wonderful bassist. Some people even call him a virtuoso bassist that makes lots of wonderful like hip-hop, jazz, fusion music out there. That's really wonderful. Shiina is a wonderful composer and lyricist that also does a lot of music, but in Japanese in specific. She's wonderful. She's got that jazz down. Jacob Collier is a multi-instrumentalist, wonderful guy that does some things in the jazz genre. Sometimes he melds into a little bit of folk every now and then. And then 𝐒𝐔𝐁𝐒 is an amazing drummer and jazz musician. That's kind of a little bit niche, but they work with like literally everybody. So modern jazz spans so many genres and fusions that it's so interesting and it has so many different shapes and forms now. So I think it's super, super cool to live. It's a very exciting time to live in for people that like jazz. You really get all different sounds from so many different people around the world, but we'll get to that. Get ready for music rap, where I take a genre and then I just do a presentation on the music genre and have that be like a monthly stream. If you're watching this YouTube video, maybe type in the comments about what genre you want me to cover next. I hope to maybe learn a little bit more about a lot of different music genres and educate people. To begin, we have the late 1800s. Jazz, as we know it, is kind of strange and a little bit weird. The genre is actually pretty new in terms of it not being like Mozart or any classical music that's been around since like the 1600s. Jazz finds its roots in actually African American people writing their slave songs and gospel hymns. So all of jazz's roots can be tied back to enslaved African American people in the late 1800s. And they would sing songs such as Wade in the Water, like a bridge over troubled water. Any sort of slave song is going to be kind of the start of jazz. Unfortunately, through slavery and everything that happened in the South, I mean, of course, we still have some slave songs, but it's not well documented due to like all the suffering that these people had to go through. And so there is an era of slave songs and gospel hymns that were sung by the African American people that aren't as well preserved. But one genre, kind of the start of jazz as we know it today, can be represented by ragtime. And that is kind of the big start. So the start of all jazz music is one, slave songs and gospel hymns, although they're not well documented. And then the first real genre that we can actually put in a box and be like, this is a completed era of jazz, is going to be ragtime. And so you might already know some ragtime classics. For example, and I'll play a little bit. I can't play a whole lot of it because, of course, YouTube copyright. But I can give you ideas about what it kind of sounded like. You might already know the song. you might be wondering, how the hell is this jazz? Because it just sounds like piano music, right? As this sort of genre of music, the Maple Leaf Rag, got popular, slowly, people were able to actually find music, instruments, and then add to it. Here's an example of that exact same piece performed by a brass jazz ensemble. And this is, of course, in New Orleans. So the same piece that you already heard on piano as ragtime started to then be picked up by people with the access to brass instruments and just anything. This genre is very, very specific, or like this kind of sound is very, very specific to New Orleans. So this might remind you of something like Princess and the Frog, where the musicians are very much like, they have this sound of like, you got the banjo, you got the brass trumpets, and you got them big drums, the boom, ba, bum, ba, bum, bum, and the rickety-dickety board. God damn it, what is it called again? Does anyone remember? A washboard. You got the fucking washboard, man! But anyways, that's just to kind of give you an idea of the sound of jazz as it started to develop from ragtime. Ragtime sounds so different than contemporary jazz as we know it today. So, I hope to get you guys focused on like the idea of these rhythms and the sound being translated and just kind of growing as the genre as it is, because everything has to grow from something, and jazz grew from ragtime. Now, one of the biggest, most influential persons of that time is Jelly Roll Morton. But this is when you can actually hear the transition from ragtime to more modern jazz. This is like early 1910s. Somewhere in that 1910s. This is where you start to hear that predominant piano music of ragtime turning into jazz. Jelly be like, Scott Joplin, hold my beer. I'm about to do something crazy style. I'm gonna have to smack you and throw a freaking Bobby at you if you don't pay attention. There's going to be a quiz on this at the end. In the 1910s and the 1920s, you actually have the start of improvisation, the age of improvisation, where you start to get solos and improv on specific instruments. You know, it's kind of standard nowadays for when you are doing like a jazz performance, each instrument in a jazz performance, whatever their standard or whatever song that they're playing, they usually have a set section where one instrument is supposed to improvise and do like a little solo, a little and so this is really the 1910s and the 1920s is when you're starting to get those solos that are starting to do scatting in them. And it really is the birth of scat singing. And you might think of like Ella Fitzgerald.
Look at me. I was helpless as a kitten up a tree, and it feels like I'm clinging to a cloud.
You know, that's how they sound. It's going to be very, very, very indicative of the 1920s era jazz. One of those also being the blues. So remember how I said that a lot of jazz is rooted in slave hymns and gospel music? We have to thank African-American people so freaking much for the origins of jazz, because, of course, blues came out of legitimate slaves and newly freed people singing about their hardships growing up in America, in the Deep South, where they are recently seen as actual people. Their generations of families that were enslaved is like, they still got that in their family. That's their great-grandparents at that point. Or their grandparents at that point that were enslaved. They created this very, very African-American sound. And so a lot of these blues came from that. And it incorporated lots of spiritual songs like hymns, shouts and chants that were very, very deeply ingrained in African-American culture. So that's how blues specifically came to be. And maybe you guys will know about another genre that isn't necessarily blues, but it's called Dixieland. And actually, you might be able to, depending on like popular media that you've seen, you might actually have heard of Dixieland music, actually, which is kind of a little bit different than the jazz that maybe you're typically able, but it's a very specific genre and a specific sound that you probably have heard before. So you remember these old movies, chat? These really old movies where they have like a band set up in a specific way. Let me show you. This is very, 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 very regional to, I would say, New Orleans for sure. You got that? You see the washboard guy in the back. So now, into the 1930s, as we've gone, this is where shit starts getting wacky. Although it isn't written during that day, it is something that you guys probably already have in your head already. And that is the Cowboy Bebop soundtrack, because it isn't the style of bebop. So the 1930s and the 40s is the age of freedom, where things start getting absolutely crazy. Now you're no longer getting hillbilly sounding like washboard rhythms. You're actually starting to get bands and big ensembles together to make crazy sounding more jazz music that's got that swing. That swing to it. This is when swing starts to actually pick up. So just to give you an idea of what bebop sounds like. I mean, I'm sure everyone already knows what Cowboy Bebop sounds like, but let me see if I can find a cover of Cowboy Bebop. And everyone knows this one. Everyone goes crazy for this one. Characteristic with those bass lines, where you start to swing shit. The hit opera Porgy and Bess actually opened in 1934, during this era where people were starting to say, oh, jazz is actually like a thing. Because before, jazz is predominantly seen as like, oh, black people music, negative, is what people thought. This was very much during the era of segregation, and when people really didn't want black people around, but they were still listening to all their music. White people were obsessed with jazz, and in fact, like, they were very much like, they had white-only clubs, but they wouldn't allow black people in. They would allow black musicians to perform for white people, but they wouldn't actually let the black people come in and sit and watch the performances. Definitely during the Prohibition era, of course, you had, like, you know, speakeasies where they had black people playing jazz, and that's like kind of where it really started to hit off, because people were engaging on quote-unquote degeneracy by drinking alcohol when it really wasn't allowed. And so they were like, fuck it, let's do something that's a little bit more taboo as well. Like, we're drinking even though we're not supposed to, but let's do something more taboo, and let's listen to black people music, is what they were thinking. And so it's very much accompanied by, again, swing dancing. And this is where jazz really starts to sound swingy. You swing that shit. Da-da-dum. Da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. And this is what you're very predominantly hearing in clubs. This is when I feel like jazz really starts to take off with everybody. Because before, I mean, you had ragtime and you had people that were enslaved that were forced to literally play piano and entertain white people. And now, you know, we've gotten out of slavery. You know, people have made it out. They've worked. And then, now that they're, like, we're in the segregation era, where black people are being mistreated and that sort of thing, but people are really starting to really like their culture, and they're liking that music, and they're like, sheesh, let me get some of that. And that's when it really, I feel like the 1930s is really when it starts to take off. Another song that'll kind of give you an idea of late 1920s, early 30s, is a song from Bessie Smith called St. Louis Blue. And it'll give you an idea of, like, what these slave hymns and just general, like, gospel singing music will sound like. Sing it, Bessie! But yeah, that's kind of, an idea of what jazz sounded like that. And see, I want you guys to notice the subtle change of everything, honestly. Again, reminding you that we started with ragtime, just purely piano music. Now we're 40 years later, and we're already sounding a lot different. And that just happened within the span of 40 years, which is insane. I will say to put it this way, but other cultures can't seem to have everything nice without white people yoinking it. Listen, it's an appreciation of sort, right? A lot of times, yes, things can be done incorrectly, but sometimes it's made out of admiration. And we can point fingers and be like, oh my god, these people were bad 40 years ago, but at some point, we're gonna be 80 years old, and we're gonna look back at ourselves and be like, oh my god, I can't believe we still found this acceptable, because times have changed, and now I'm looking at my former, like, I don't know, 30, 40-year-old self, and I'm thinking, wow, I can't believe they did that. As they say, truly, hindsight is 20/20. And although we can't condone a lot of the things that happened back then, we just kind of have to accept that the world is going to keep going on, and things are going to change. And so we'll get into that more. Because, oh boy, has jazz changed since the 40s.